Once again, it's time to take a trip back to 1968. So, without further ado, let's take a look at some cool British singles, released in July of that year. Let's begin.
I'm on my own, and my own mind's me. Well.
July 1968 saw the release of the last single by the Small Faces. It wasn't a bad single, but this is definitely one of the least exciting 45s the group ever issued. Just a few months before, in May 1968, the Small Faces had released Ogden's Nut Gone Flake. The album was regarded by the press as one of the best records of the year, so this decline in quality caught both reviewers and fans by surprise. Just a few months after the release of the single, Steve Marriott left the band and formed Humble Pie with Peter Frampton. Looking back at the single in retrospect, it seems pretty clear that at this point, Marriott had lost interest in the band and wanted to move on to something else. The Melody Maker gave the single a very negative review.
This is either the worst release of their career or the most original. It's a staggering change from the Faces' usual sound, and Marriott doesn't even sound like the Steve we all know and dig. Strange Dylan-type lyrics, sung to a 12-string guitar with added Don Partridge-type bass drum thumping, plus corny trombone, clarinet and street noises. The vocal sounds decidedly serious, with the deadpan qualities of a Ray Davies performance, yet the backing sounds like the Small Faces out of work aged about 70. As a Faces fan, I hope somebody likes it, but this strikes me as a catastrophic mistake.
The B-side was a group composition.
I like wasting my days in a caravan.
The single reached number 16. July 1968 also saw the release of Family's second single. Both sides of the single were featured on their first album, which was produced by Dave Mason from Traffic and also released in July. This album, along with the first record by The Nice, is widely considered to be one of the first progressive rock albums ever released, and the group had a huge influence on bands like Jethro Tull and Genesis.
But I wish me, my friend, I could sail to the stars.
Penny Valentine from Disc Magazine wrote,
Family are one of those groups people talk to me about, saying very good, nice, and so forth. The Family have in fact made appearances on Rolling Stones tracks, but this is their first single, produced by Dave Mason, and it has a lot of Traffic feel about it. It certainly is most interesting.
Penny Valentine was wrong in her review. This was actually the band's second single. Their first 45 was released in October 1967. The B-side was another excellent song.
Mr. Policeman, 1 minute bill.
Family quickly became one of the premier attractions on the burgeoning UK psychedelic and progressive underground scene. And even though the single failed to chart, the album charted at number 35, mostly due to the support of disc jockey John Peel, who regarded the album as one of the best records of 1968, and often promoted the group on his radio show. Later in 1969, bassist Rick Gresh left the band and joined Blind Faith. The first lineup of Fleetwood Mac with Peter Green on guitar is still regarded as one of the best British blues groups of all time. This release from July 1968 was the group's third single. The New Musical Express wrote,
Although they've had a big LP hit, the Fleetwood Mac are still looking for their first single hit, and I shall be very surprised if this is it, because it's too limited in its appeal. Having said that, let me add that it's a super disc. A slow, soulful blues written by Little Willie John and imploringly wailed by Peter Green, with a string section added as the sole concession to commerciality. I only hope I'm wrong about its chances.
The single peaked at number 31 and remained in the top 40 for 7 weeks.
May I say I don't believe a single word you said.
Plastic Penny scored a top 5 hit in early 1968 with a slow ballad version of Everything I Am, a Dan Penn and Spooner Oldham composition which was originally recorded by the Box Tops.
Everything I'm, darling, I'm because of you.
The group never managed to replicate the success of that song, but this single from July 1968 was one of the best 45s the group ever issued. Both sides of the single were excellent psychedelic pop numbers with some progressive undertones. The record got excellent reviews in the press. The New Musical Express wrote,
Pin back your ears, dig in your toes, pick your nose and stand by for the new sound of Plastic Penny. Yes, folks, here is an exciting blast of sheer jive that will cause young girls to loosen their stays and lose their inhibitions, while young boys will close their eyes and sway rhythmically to the beat as if crazed. Listen for heavy bass patterns, good vocals, and a solid lead guitar.
The B-side was also a good song.
Pushing aside your caution and pride, your future looks unstable.
Despite the good reviews, the single was a commercial failure, and the band broke up in late 1969.
But the man at the back, all dressed in black, started to sing.
July 1968 also saw the release of this excellent 45 by Skip Bifferty. The single was produced by Steve Marriott and Ronnie Lane from the Small Faces.
She wears many colors, a sapphire ring.
This was the group's third single, and just like the previous 45s, the single was a flop. The song, however, enjoyed decent promotion on the radio. John Peel was a big fan of the band, and he played the song on his radio show on several occasions, but it wasn't enough to turn the single into a chart success. Skip Bifferty's first and only LP, which was actually recorded a year before in August 1967, was also released in July. The album was released by RCA and featured sleeve notes by John Peel.
If you ever need me, come round.
Skip Bifferty were managed by Don Arden, who gained a reputation in Britain for his violent and sometimes illegal business tactics, which led to his being called the English Godfather.
If I've ever exploited anybody, it's for their own benefit. It's because they want to be exploited. I never exploit anybody who doesn't want to be exploited.
Shortly after the release of this single, the band decided to break away from the manager because they felt he was responsible for their lack of success. But rather than face Arden's wrath, the group decided to remain outside London, at one point hiding out on the Isle of Wight. However, their reputation was based on performances at venues such as the Marquee, and they decided to return to London. Being concerned about Arden's psychotic behaviour, the band notified the local police in Beckenham that they might be in physical danger. Skip Bifferty returned to their base and were approached by a vehicle loaded with Arden's men. Bassist Colin Gibson recalled,
The hired heavies were intercepted by the Beckenham Constabulary en route to discussing our contract with Mr. Arden. Their car contained several baseball bats, and the driver gave his name as Don Harden, although clearly Don Arden was not in the car.
As a result, in December 1968, the group decided they were no longer able to continue, and vocalist Graham Bell informed the music press that the group had disbanded. Ice in the Sun was Status Quo's third single. The song, which was written by Marty Wilde and Ronnie Scott, became the group's second hit single. Record Mirror wrote,
This should have been the immediate follow-up to Matchstick Men. Much better than the selected one. This is a song written by Marty Wilde, and it's got all sorts of curious sound effects, plus that distinctive Status Quo vocal sound. I understand the effects come from running a plectrum over the strings of a grand piano. This is compelling listening.
The single reached number 8 in the British charts, spending 12 weeks in the listing. In the States, the song peaked at number 70, and it was to be their last appearance in the US charts. One of the biggest British hits from July 1968 was Last Night in Soho by Davies and Company. In contrast to the exotic themes of their previous two singles, the song was set in Soho, renowned for much of the 20th century, as a base for the city's sex industry and nightlife. The New Musical Express wrote,
Another thumping great hit for the Dave D Group, and full credit to the Howard Blakely team for continuing to provide the boys with such fascinating material. Rather like a musical Doctor Who, you never know where the boys are going to end up next. And on this occasion, the journey direct from the burning wastes of the Mexican desert to that sleazy square mile of London's West End known as Soho. Just like Xanadu, it's a Storian song, with the singer lamenting the fact that he has been tempted from the straight and narrow by a bunch of undesirables. And here, he is saying goodbye to his girl before he's carted off to the clink.
The song peaked at number 8, ultimately spending 11 weeks on the chart. It was the group's final top 10 single. Another highlight from July 1968 was this B-side by a group called The Glass Opening. This was a great psychedelic rocker with wild guitar sounds and excellent soul-influenced vocals. The band sounded like a more psychedelic version of the Equals. The single was barely reviewed in the press and the record went pretty much unnoticed. But this B-side was rediscovered years later, when the song was featured on a few compilations of obscure British singles from the 60s.
When we meet for a while on a Saturday, sunny Saturday afternoon.
Keith West achieved great success in 1967 with a song called Excerpt from a Teenage Opera, which became a huge hit all over Europe. His success as the lead singer of Tomorrow, however, was limited. Tomorrow disbanded in early 1968, and this was his first solo single after the breakup of the band. Both sides of the single feature Ronnie Wood on bass, and future Yes member Steve Howe on guitar. The B-side was another good song.
The kid was a killer, don't you make no mistake.
The New Musical Express wrote,
After his teenage opera adventures, Keith West is now treading the solo path. And here he comes up with one of his own compositions. I suspect that part of Grocer Jack has rubbed off on him, because this relates another real-life incident about a young couple getting together in their off-duty moments at the weekend. And many fans will find a certain self-identification appeal about the lyric. I love the guitars and rhythm backing, and Keith handles it competently.
The single didn't chart. July 1968 also saw the release of the third solo single by Davies. Just like his two previous solo singles, Dave was backed by the Kinks. Penny Valentine wrote,
Mr. Davies, via 3 singles, has cleverly developed an original and distinctive sound. This has his voice sounding almost treble-tracked. It's much better than Susanna's Still Alive, and it has strange violins on the chorus. He wrote it himself and it's got a very strained quality. I liked it. I think it's going to be a hit.
Unlike the previous two Davies singles, Lincoln Country flopped internationally and at home, only hitting number 15 on the Dutch singles chart and missing the charts elsewhere.
I found her in amongst a sea of faces. She gazed upon me with the starry eyes.
This single by Hopscotch is one of those 60s singles that have become truly expensive collector's items. Original copies of the single sell for more than £500. Hopscotch were formed in Scotland in 1967 and this was the first of 2 singles that they recorded for United Artists. The single got a decent amount of promotion in the press, with several ads promoting its release. But despite the promotion, the single went largely unnoticed, and it only managed to get this small review from Record Mirror. Later in the 70s, several members of Hopscotch formed the Average White Band.
Yes, I'm a man that's born for gladness and loves immortal fire.
One of the best psychedelic singles from July 1968 was this 45 by a group called Sleepy.
As I looked into the sky to see the dark clouds drawing in.
Record Mirror wrote,
Woodwind or flute or something. Anyway, it's that bit different, and the boys, wide awake all of them, put their considerable all into a smooth performance.
just like many psychedelic singles from that period, the record went pretty much unnoticed, but the song was rediscovered years later when it appeared on several compilations of obscure 60s singles. Just like the previously mentioned Hopscotch single, this 45 has also become a very expensive collector's item. Those of you who are into psychedelic pop with a strong emphasis on pop are probably familiar with this B-side by a group called Toby Twirl. The song has been featured on many psychedelic compilations over the years, and it has become a cult classic among fans of the poppier side of psychedelia. The song was written by Wayne Bickerton and Tony Waddington. Bickerton and Waddington also wrote this track by the Flirtations, called Nothing But a Heartache, which was released later in November 1968 and became a huge soul classic. In fact, if you listen to Romeo and Juliet, you will notice that the melodies of both songs are quite similar. The A-side was a song called Toffee Apple Sundae, a good song very much in the style of many psychedelic pop singles from that period. Toby Twirl only managed to release 3 singles before breaking up in 1971. I hope you enjoyed this trip back to July 1968. See you next time.